I'm not really going to give a talk. I'm just going to continue what I was doing last time, which was reading and talking about who am I, until any of you want to interrupt me with questions, and then we can go on with questions. But since we chanted Om at the beginning, I thought of saying what Bhagavan said about the meaning of Om. In one of the verses of Atma-vichara, Bhagavan says, Omkaraparo Opoya Villoi Unaya Ariva Arunachala. That Omkaraparo means the import or the reality of Om. Opoya Villoi, unequaled and unsurpassed. Unaya Ariva, who can understand you, O Arunachala? So Arunachala, the meaning of Om is Arunachala. And as Bhagavan also said many times, Arunachala is I. So when we chant Om, what we should remember is not the sound of the mantra, but what it denotes, which is I. That is what Bhagavan asks us to constantly remember. But we are so interested in this external world that we are constantly overlooking what is ever present, and our mind is darting after these fleeting appearances. Last time I read through the first 6 paragraphs of Nāṉ Yār, who am I? So I'll just continue from where I left. In the 7th paragraph, Bhagavan begins by saying, Yathakamai Ulladu Atmasrupam Andre. That which actually exists is only Atmaswarupa. That is Bhagavan's experience. It is not our experience because we see all this multiplicity. So Bhagavan then explains how all this multiplicity comes into existence. What is the reality of all this? Bhagavan says, the world, soul, and God are kalpanegal in it, that's in Atmaswarupa, like silver in a shell. Kalpanegal means, kalpana is a Sanskrit word that means fabrication, imagination, mental creation, or illusory superimposition. So the world, the soul, that's our self as an individual, and God are all mere mental fabrications, imaginations, like the silver we see in a shell. These three appear simultaneously and disappear simultaneously. As soon as we wake up from sleep, we see the world, we have thoughts about God, whether he exists or not, or whatever we may choose to think about him. Most of us think about him. The atheists think about him more than the rest of us, but whatever it is, it's hard to get away from the idea of God. And then Bhagavan says, what all these things are. Swarupa, that's our own self. Alone is the world. Swarupa alone is I. Swarupa alone is God. Everything is Shiva Swarupa. Shiva Swarupa means our self, which is Shiva, the absolute reality. So one of the first supporters of Dawkins is Bhagavan. So just like Dawkins said, God is a delusion, Bhagavan also says God is a delusion. But Bhagavan doesn't stop with that. Dawkins is a little partial, because he chooses only God as a delusion. He forgets to tell us that, or probably he doesn't yet understand, that the world and ourselves who see the world are also delusions. What is real is only the I. But when we rise as I am this person, then the world and God also seem to come into existence. Then in the next paragraph, in the 6th paragraph, he tells about the actual practice of who am I. Then in this paragraph, he begins to talk, in the 8th and 9th paragraph, he talks about other practices. And he begins the 8th paragraph by saying, to make the mind subside, there is no adequate means other than vichara. By here, when Bhagavan talks about the mind subsiding, in Upadesha Undiya, he says there's two types of subsidence of mind, laya and nasa. Laya is temporary subsidence, nasa is permanent subsidence, destruction. And what subsides in laya will rise again, what subsides in nasa will never rise again, because nasa is the state in which we realize that the mind never actually arose, the state in which we experience ajata, the non-creation or non-origination of anything. That which is alone is and it always is. So when Bhagavan says here to make the mind subside, he's not talking about subside as in sleep or as in laya, but to make the mind subside permanently in the state of nasa. There is no adequate means other than vichara. The reason for this is the difference between vichara and everything else that we do. Anything we do, any type of sadhana or any worldly activity or anything, involves attending to something other than I. Without attending to something other than I, we can't do our meditation on God, we can't do our mantra japa, we can't do our puja, we can't do our worldly activities, we can't go and rob the bank, we can't become President of the United States, we can't become rich businessman, we can't do anything without attending to things other than I. So the vichara is unique, because vichara is the state in which we attend to nothing other than I. And the reason why that alone will destroy the mind, so long as we're attending to anything other than I, we are feeding the mind. We feed the mind on thoughts and on all the things we see through we perceive through our senses. So long as the mind is attending to these things, it seems to exist. When we attend to I, where is the mind? It disappears. The mind is, Bhagavan says, it's just like a ghost. It's a phantom. It has no form of its own. Only by grasping forms in the form of thoughts or objects of the senses, or all the things that we experience outwardly according to Bhagavan includes our own thoughts and feelings. Anything other than I, according to Bhagavan, is outward. So long as we're attending to anything outward, the mind isn't going to be destroyed. To destroy it, the only way is vichara, attending only to I. And then Bhagavan goes on to say, if restrained by other means, the mind will remain as if subsided, but will emerge again. Even by pranayama, by breath restraint, the mind will subside. However, though the mind remains subsided, so long as the breath remains subsided, when the breath emerges or becomes manifest, the mind will also emerge and wander under the sway of its vasanas, its predispositions. The birthplace of both the mind and the prana is one. Thought alone is the swarupa, the form of the mind. The thought I alone is the first thought of the mind. It alone is the ego. From where the ego arises, from there alone the breath starts. Therefore, when the mind subsides, the prana also subsides, and when the prana subsides, the mind also subsides. So basically, Bhagavan's there just giving in a nutshell why pranayama brings about the subsidence of the mind. That is, the pranayama is a trick used in yoga to make the mind subside. It's an artificial means to make the mind subside. But as Bhagavan says, it will rise again. So it's only of temporary benefit. It's not going to yield any permanent fruit. And then Bhagavan says something which is not actually his own teachings, but it's from the point of view of yoga, because he's explaining in terms of yoga. Because people then are liable to raise the question, in sleep our mind subsides, but people seeing our body see it still breathing. So how is that? So Bhagavan's real answer to that is, your body in sleep doesn't exist in your view. It only exists in the view of others, who exist only when you wake up. And only when you're awake they tell you, we saw your body breathing when you were asleep. According to Bhagavan, there's no body, nothing when we're asleep. All these imaginations that arise when we wake up. So Bhagavan says, however, in sleep, even though the mind has subsided, the breath does not subside. That's from the point of view of yoga, or the point of view of beyond other people. It is arranged thus by the ordinance of God for the purpose of protecting the body, and so that other people do not wonder whether the body is dead. Here he said it's ordained by the ordinance of God. In the previous paragraph he said God is just an imagination. So there itself he's giving us a clue. This is only diluted truth he's saying here. It's not the absolute truth. It's true so long as we take the body to be something real and the world to be something real. And so long as we take the body and world to be real, Bhagavan says it's wrong to dismiss God, because God is as real as the world. Actually, God is our own self, but so long as we see differences, we see the world as something other than ourselves, we imagine the supreme reality, which is ourself, to be something other than ourself. When the mind subsides in waking and in samadhi, the prana subsides. The prana is said to be the gross form of the mind. Until the time of death, the mind keeps the prana in the body, and at the moment the body dies, it grabs it and takes it away. Therefore, pranayama is just an aid to restrain the mind, but will not bring about mananasa, the annihilation of the mind. Then in the 9th paragraph he continues in the same line, talking about other types of practices. Just like pranayama, muti dhyana, that's meditation upon a form of God, mantra japa, repetition of mantras or names of God, and ahara niyama, restriction of our diet, are only aids that restrain the mind. And because he said just like pranayama, we have to connect it with the previous sentence, they restrain the mind, we have to infer they do not bring about its annihilation. They're aids, but they're not going to bring about the final goal we require. By both muti dhyana and mantra japa, the mind gains one-pointedness. Just as if someone gives a chain in the trunk of an elephant, which is always moving, that elephant will proceed grasping the chain without grasping anything else. So the mind, which is always moving, will, if trained in the practice of thinking of any one particular name or form, remain grasping it. That is, mantra japa and muti dhyana, they're ways of weaning the mind away from many thoughts and training it to cling to one thought. The Bhagavan says we then have to use that one-pointedness to cling to the root of all thoughts, which is the I thought. Because the mind spreads out as innumerable thoughts, each thought becomes extremely weak. For the mind which has gained one-pointedness, when thoughts progressively become reduced, and which has thereby gained strength, Atma-vichara will be easily accomplished. How muti dhyana and mantra japa are efficacious and how they help us to achieve Atma-vichara, if we try to train our mind to think of any other object, say a Coca-Cola can, firstly we will find it very difficult unless we are really passionately attached to drinking Coca-Cola. But why muti dhyana and mantra japa are efficacious? Because the murti is God. And the mantra is the name of God. If we are devoted to God, our devotion to God will make it easy for us to continuously think of His form or His name. So what is actually the efficacy in muti dhyana and mantra japa is not merely fixing the mind on one thing. What enables us to fix the mind on that one thing is the love. So if the love in the practice of Moti Dhyana Mantra Japa, which purifies the mind. And when the mind becomes purified, it understands that there's nothing external but is going to yield happiness, but real happiness lies within. And thereby the love for God matures into love for self, Swarupa Bhakti. Bhagavan here he indicates that elsewhere in Maharshi's Gospel and many other places. Bhagavan points out another step. Our love for God will eventually bring us to Guru, who is God in human form. The Guru then gives us the teaching and tells us God is not external to you, Guru is not external to you. The real God and real Guru is your own self, turn within. So the bhakti for God becomes Guru Bhakti, which eventually matures into Swarupa Bhakti. But Bhagavan doesn't deal with all that here, but we, understanding his teachings as a whole, we can read all that into this passage. And then he concludes this paragraph with an important sentence. Vaimita Sattvika Ahara Niyama. Ahara Niyama means restriction of what we eat, and Mitta Sattvika means moderate quantity, and Sattvika means what is conducive to the state of being. Sattva means beingness. So whatever is conducive to keeping the mind in the quiet state of being, that is sattvika. So the food which will be conducive to keeping us in the state of being is what is sattvika ahara. So when Bhagavan was asked what he means by sattvika ahara, one thing he was absolutely insistent on, vegetarian diet is absolutely essential, because if we eat any animal products, that particularly the flesh of animals that have been killed, that cannot be conducive to keeping our mind in a state of beingness. When animals are killed, they feel fear and all that, and they suffer. Just like we are attached to our bodies, animals are also attached to their bodies. Just like we want to continue living in this body, they want to continue living in their body. But for the sake of consuming their flesh, people murder them. So that the flesh of a murdered living being, a sentient being like us, is not going to be conducive to putting our mind in a state of beingness. So contrary to what someone remarked beforehand, Bhagavan doesn't recommend we eat meat. Bhagavan says, one thing, if you could do nothing else, at least avoid eating meat. Because by avoiding eating meat, we may not be able to save all the billions of animals that are being slaughtered every day for food, but at least we'll be saving one or two. We'll be not contributing to a huge, huge harm, but humanity is doing to animals. So Bhagavan was very, very insistent about vegetarian diet. Among vegetarian diets, some foods are more sattvic than others. Often it is said garlic and onions are not sattvic, and obviously if you eat a lot of processed junk food, that's not going to be so sattvic. And you could say alcohol, okay, that's also vegetarian, but that's not going to be so sattvic. So just because the food is of plant origin doesn't necessarily make it sattvic, but if it's not of plant origin, it's definitely not sattvic. Just fairly sensible. Eat food that is not causing harm to any other living beings, and food that is not agitating our mind too much, and food that is not making our mind too dull also. If we eat very heavy foods or too much food, it makes the mind dull, tamasic. That also is to be avoided. Okay. So we learn by experience. Understand by analysing our own experience that the essence of what we really are is neither this body nor the mind. So all that remains in sleep, the only thing that we experience in sleep is our own being, I am. So that is the only thing that is real according to Bhagavan. Because what is real must always be real. And Bhagavan gives three definitions of reality. It must be permanent, eternal. It must be unchanging. Because if a thing changes, it's one thing at one time, another thing at another time. So which of those two things is real? What is real must be always exist, it must never change, and the third most important definition of reality that Bhagavan gave, it must be in Tamil Bhagavan used a Sanskrit word actually, swayam prakasha, self-shining. What that means is, it must know its own existence. So we think the world existed before I was born and it will exist afterwards. But does the world know its own existence? Does a tree, well no, let's say a building, does the building know that it exists? It doesn't. But we know that we exist. So whatever is real must experience its own existence. If its existence is only known by something other than it, because we cannot say anything exists if it's not experienced. If it exists only in the experience of something else, its existence is dependent on that thing. Therefore, for something is real only if it experiences its own existence. And of all the things that we experience, can you tell me anything that experiences its own existence? In your experience, yourself. You may think, oh, this Michael's talking to me, he must also be experiencing his own existence because he's talking all these things. But actually this Michael, you see, is only a thought of yours. It's only something a projection of your mind. How can you know that Michael is really sentient? A computer could be talking exactly the same thing, but we don't think the computer is sentient, do we? So we know only one consciousness. No one ever experiences more than one consciousness. So that one consciousness which we experience as I, we should make research on that. Bhagavan says if you make research on that, you will eventually find experience that that is the only thing that actually exists. But Bhagavan doesn't say, believe me. He says, no use believing, because belief is just again a thought in the mind. Who is the one who is believing or not believing? Make research on that. Find out who is this I. So all this research about food that we were just talking about, that's all fine. Up to a certain point. But we shouldn't make too much research on any of these things. We should make research only on I. That is Bhagavan's recommendation. Why we are drawn to Bhagavan's teachings? We somehow, even before all the rationalization, we have a gut feeling, oh, there's some truth in this. But we need a strong conviction. And the intellectualization there are two benefits in the intellectualization of it. One is, it helps to create a conviction, albeit at the surface level of the mind. But it helps to ward off many unnecessary thoughts. If we have a strong conviction that this is the truth. Because there are so many ideas, so many beliefs people have in this world. Unless we decide what we believe, we're going to be always frittering between one belief and another, whatever people tell us. Decide to a large extent by gut feeling. What feels right to us. But by intellectualizing, it helps to ward off, to free our mind of doubts about so many other possibilities. Okay, but so that is one benefit. The other benefit of having a good intellectual understanding of what Bhagavan has taught us is, we have to put this into, Bhagavan teachings is all about practice. The theory is only to help us in our practice. So having a proper intellectual understanding is necessary. It's necessary to understand that we're not this body, we're not this mind. If we think, okay, I understand I'm not this body, but I think I'm this mind, as many philosophers have concluded, we will then think that by watching our thoughts or observing the thoughts, we are observing ourselves. But Bhagavan says, no, these thoughts are not yourself. They're things you experience as other than yourself. Who is it who experiences these thoughts? So he brings us back to the I. So for that also, this intellectual discrimination is useful. But there's a thing called sastravasana, where some people who have so much taste in this philosophy, they go on and on reading and thinking of these things, they never actually put it into practice. So we have to use discrimination. We have to use philosophy to the extent to which it's useful, and not overuse it so that it takes up our whole life. Bhagavan says many things because as a concession to our ignorance. The main thing Bhagavan says is, don't see me as this body. I am not this body. In my experience, I am not this body. Because we are not ready to accept that teaching, we see Bhagavan as a body, and then Bhagavan comes down to our level and says, yes, I see the world, I see this, and I talk to you and everything. But actually Bhagavan doesn't see us at all. He does see us, but he sees only the real us. He doesn't see us as a person. But by his not seeing us as a person, that is the greatest act of grace. Because if he sees us as a person, he'll be giving reality to what is unreal. So, thank God, he doesn't see us as a person. He sees us only as self. What is a thought? Whenever we pay attention to anything other than I, that is a thought. So if we pay attention to I, we can, depending on how we choose to define our terms, we can either say attending to I is a thought, it's a thought of I, or we can say it's a state of thoughtlessness. Both are true, it just depends on what you mean by the terms you're using. If you use thought in the very strict sense of thought is the attention we pay to something other than I, then self-attention is not a thought. If we use a thought, if we broaden our definition of thought to mean whatever we attend to, that is a thought of that thing, then attending to I is a thought of I. But it's different to all other thoughts. Because whereas other thoughts feed the mind, make the mind rise, thinking of I, in other words, attending to I, makes the mind subside. Because the mind rises only by grasping things other than itself. If we attend only to I, the mind is not grasping anything, so it subsides. He said, do you need to be shown the way inside your own home? You don't. It cannot be. Words are only pointers. Words are efficacious only to a certain extent, pointing us in the right direction. But only our own experience will tell us what self-attention is. Moreover, any person who is still practicing Atma-vichara is self-attention, but any person who is practicing Atma-vichara does not know what self-attention is. Because that is why Bhagavan called it vichara. Vichara means investigation. We have a vague idea what self-attention is. We are coming close to self-attention. But if we, for one moment, attend to self correctly, if we, for one moment, experience pure self-attention, that is Atma-vichara. So when we practice vichara, we are investigating, trying to find out what is that state of self-attention. So the only way to find out what is self-attention is to attend to self. And the more we practice and the more we do it, the more we will discover. And what we discover cannot be said cannot be put into words, cannot be put into thoughts even. But we will gain more and more clarity of self-awareness. It will be more and more clear to us what self-attention is, what self-awareness is, what self-consciousness is, what we really are. There's I remember in an old mountain path, in the mountain path they sometimes give fillers. There was one very nice filler back in the late 70s, early 70s, sometime like that. It was a translation of a passage from one of the untranslated writings of Suri Nagama. And there she records, once some learned pundits had come and were talking with Bhagavan for several days about all these nadis, chakras and all these things. And Bhagavan was patiently answering all their questions. Hearing all this, Suri Nagama was feeling very dejected because she didn't understand all these Sanskrit words. What are these nadis, what is this Sahasrara, this Shushumna, all these things. She didn't understand any of these terms. So she waited till Bhagavan till those learned people had gone out, and then she said to Bhagavan, oh no, I think she was just sitting there looking dejected, and Bhagavan asked her, what is it? And she said, Bhagavan, you're talking all these things. When will I ever know about these things? I'm not able to understand all these things. And Bhagavan said, why should you worry about all these things? They're all imagination. And she said, what? It's imagination. Bhagavan said, when the body itself is an imagination, what are all these chakras and all these things? It's all imagination. So this heart on the right-hand side of the chest, Bhagavan first said that to Kavyaganta and his followers. Then people asked him, is there any scriptural authority for this? Then Bhagavan said, it is mentioned somewhere in some Atma-vichara, there's some mention of it. And also Bhagavan found in a Malayalam translation of an Ayurvedic text called Ashtanga Hridaya, the Eightfold Heart. There is mention about this, and he translated those two Malayalam verses. Originally they would have been Sanskrit slokas, but Bhagavan had only seen it in the Malayalam version. He translated those two verses into Tamil, and they became part of Ulunaptu and Abandhan. But Bhagavan said on many occasions, heart means self. It doesn't mean any point in the body. And when in talks, at one point when someone asked Bhagavan, should I meditate on the right side of the chest in order to meditate on self? Bhagavan said meditation shouldn't be on the right or the left. It shouldn't be up or down. Meditation should be on I. That's all. Bhagavan said the only, among the three times, the only time that actually exists is the present, because past and future are just thoughts that occur in the present. So among the three times, the only time we should take interest in is the present. In Tamil they call what we call three persons in English, first person, second person, third person. In Tamil they call the three places. So Bhagavan said among the three places, it's only the first place, the self place. That is the only place we should be concerned with. So that I is always here and it's always now. So we shouldn't worry about any other place or any other time. Concentrate on the here and now, what actually is now. And if we try to find out what actually is now, no thought can rise there, because thought happens in time. When Bhagavan talks of heart, 99.9% of times he's talking only about self. Heart is a synonym for self. Okay. It's only in the context of people who ask about a place in the body that he talks about the right side of the chest. But that's not what he's normally talking about when he talks about heart. Heart is self. So wherever you see Bhagavan saying heart, take it to mean self. And forget about the body, right hand side, left hand side, up, down, inside, outside. We are so soaked in thinking in physical terms, in terms of a body, that it's difficult for us to think beyond that. But what Bhagavan is asking is think beyond it. Go beyond this. What is this I? Bhagavan of his own accord never recommended any sadhana. Bhagavan answered people's questions. Sadhuam once told me, if people came to Bhagavan and said, Bhagavan, I'm doing puja or japa or dhyana, is this good? Bhagavan said, yes, it's good. If they come to Bhagavan and said, Bhagavan, I don't know what to do, what should I do? He would say, do self-enquiry. If they come to Bhagavan and say, Bhagavan, I'm not able to do anything, Bhagavan asks you, who asked you to do anything? Keep quiet, surrender. So it's according to the questions we ask Bhagavan, he gives answers. But Bhagavan doesn't actually teach any sadhana. If at all he teaches any sadhana, it is the sadhana of self-inquiry. You have to have a blemishless mind to do self-inquiry, because if you turn your attention towards I, at that moment your mind is blemishless. So we shouldn't put off self-inquiry thinking that we need purity of mind. The very fact that you have an interest in self-inquiry, a taste to at least try a little, means you've at least to that extent got a little bit of purity of mind, a little ray of a little spark of that Swapna Bhakti has been kindled in your heart by Bhagavan's grace. Fan that, forget everything else, forget all your impurities. Just that little spark of purity that is there, that's been kindled by Bhagavan, fan that. And the way to fan it is by self-attention. It's expressed in words, either in writing or in speech. It takes the form of a question. Yeah. But Bhagavan didn't actually ask us to question who am I. He asked us to investigate who am I.
So investigate by just kind of looking?
By looking, I'm just saying to some other people, if I give you a book and said, find what is in this book, you don't sit and question what is in this book, what is in this book. You open the book and look inside. So when Bhagavan says, investigate who am I, we should look inside and find out what is this I. He's not asking us to question who am I. Sometimes it may be useful to ask a question just to remind yourself, but that question itself is not the inquiry, is not the investigation. But that is just the reminder to turn your attention back towards the I.
It's not a verbal thing.
It's not verbal.
It's not really
yeah. It's not wrong to occasionally ask yourself, oh, who's thinking these thoughts? Who's experiencing all this? It's not wrong. But don't take that to be the inquiry. Because you can sit repeating, who am I? Bhagavan said, don't make it like a mantra, like a japa.
So is it more like just being vigilant?
Yes, it's being vigilant about, being ever vigilant, remembering that I am. Bhagavan says in Who Am I, in one sentence, he says, if we can hold on to continuous, to ceaseless self-remembrance until we attain self, that alone is sufficient. So just remembering I am, that's all that we need to do. So simple. But it appears difficult because we don't want to do it, because we've got much more interest in so many. We've got this beautiful world outside. Who wants to be looking inside of this boring eye? There are not two different eyes. The eye that disappears, when we talk about the eye disappearing, when we look at it, what disappears is all the adjuncts. Now I feel I am Michael. But when I look at this eye, Michael drops off. So I say, oh, the eye has gone. Actually, the substance of the eye, it's like if you see a snake, you're walking in the half light of dusk, and you see a snake on the ground. If you look at it very carefully, the snake disappears, and what remains is the rope. But they're not two different things. Actually, you were always seeing only the rope. So now we're only experiencing the real I now, but we mistake it to be this mind, this body. Ramana has written thousands and thousands of verses relating expressing in words what he experienced by Bhagavan's grace. So Murugan didn't go around saying I am a jnani, but in literally many thousands of verses, he has made that very, very clear. Sadhu Om, on the other hand, there are slight hints here and there, but they're very indirect hints. Like Sadhu Om has written one book called Ramana Sahasram. It's 1,000 verses praying for jnana. And towards the end, in one verse, he said, Have I attained? Have I not attained? I don't know. It's a different way of expressing. So Sadhu-om, my own belief is both Murana and Sadhu-om have attained the same state. For a particular purpose, Bhagavan used Murana's body and mind to sing so many verses about expressing about the state of attainment, and he used Sadhu-om's body and mind to express that state of prayer and anguish. Actually their state is the same, but if you see their verses, Murana has also written many verses of prayer, but most of Murana's verses are expressing that his wonder, the great grace of Bhagavan, what Bhagavan is doing. Sadhu-om doesn't sing like that. That is obviously Bhagavan chose to use them, their bodies and minds in different ways. Even to say Bhagavan is a jnani is actually wrong. Because when we say Bhagavan is a jnani, we point to the body. But Bhagavan is not his body. So just taking Bhagavan to be the body itself shows our ignorance. So that's why Bhagavan says, who can understand the state, that state? None of us can understand what state Bhagavan is in. We can only experience it. If we're experiencing it, then there will be no more problems. Sadhu-om has written a very nice poem called, the meaning of which is, who is a jnani?
Yeah.
And in it he says, there's only one jnani and you are that. All the other jnanis you see are just projections of your own ignorance. Because you see a body and you say this is a jnani, that is ignorance.